In this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make this rather stylish baguette style of clutch bag. But the interesting thing about the bag is the fabrics that I've used, because I've used a technique called chenilling or fabric slashing, which is basically using layers of fabric, cutting in between the layers, put it through the washing machine or giving it a scrub, and you end up with this really lovely soft fluffy kind of effect to the fabric. I think you're going to be hooked when you get started. You can experiment with wavy lines and embroidering over the top of it. With the bag, however, we've got the button on the front, which is purely decorative. It fastens with a magnetic clasp. It's absolutely fully lined, and I've even put a little D-ring on the inside, so you've got somewhere to keep your keys as well. If you enjoy the video at the end, it'd be lovely to have you to subscribe to my channel, and in that way you get a notification before anybody else of any new videos that are coming along. And of course, you're going to be meeting my puppy Bobbin. Let's go and get on with some sewing, shall we? Hello. I put together 4 layers of fabric, and my fabric measures 15 inches by 10 inches, but this will be cut down to size after it's been washed because it may twist a little bit or shrink. The 2 fabrics that are going to stand out are the one on the top and the one on the bottom. So my bottom fabric is a bright blue, my top fabric is bright green, and then I've just got a couple of contrasting fabrics in like teal and pink colours and the mustard yellow. Now it doesn't matter about the print on these fabrics, and you're barely going to see them. They're just there to add a bit of texture and extra colours. So this is a great way of using up maybe the fabrics that you weren't so fond of in a fat quarter pack that you've bought, for instance. Now take a diagonal line, so you'll need your ruler and an erasable ink pen, and we're going to draw a line straight down the centre from one corner to another. I've already drawn mine, as you can see. And then we'll need another line 1/2 inch away from that one in each direction. So you can either, if you want to be really accurate, use your ruler and measure and mark 1/2 inch all the way across, or like on my sewing machine, I can actually move the needle across to the right hand side, which gives me a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I can simply use the side of the foot on the sewing machine as my gauge. I've already sewn together half of this, so let's carry on and do the second half. I'm using quite a small stitch, so it's 2.2 on this machine. Line up the foot with the row of stitching that I've already made and just sew straight down. And we'll carry on doing this all the way across until the whole of the pieces of fabric are sewn together nice and evenly. There we go. So again, I will trim all of this back later on, so don't worry that it's not looking too neat at the moment. Then you're going to take a sharp pair of scissors, doesn't matter what size they are as long as they're really sharp, and you're going to go in between every one of those rows of stitching that you've made and cut through them, but don't cut through the bottom piece. So just make sure that when you thread your scissors in here, you're just catching the top 3 layers, and then snip down the centre till you have that. And we're going to go all the way across, missed a layer there, and snip through every single piece. So you can see already the effect starting to take place. Miss that bottom layer again. There we go. So I'll just do a few rows because you'll see the idea. Nice thing is with this technique as well, it doesn't matter if your stitches aren't perfectly straight, doesn't matter what colour of thread you use, because you're really not going to see this when we've finished with the chenilling. Okay, I'll just do one more, then I'll explain what happens next. Now there is a reason why I've cut and sewn all of these lines on the diagonal. If you're sewing on the grain, no matter which way it is, whether it's across or up and down, you're going to get an awful lot of fraying with cotton, and maybe that's the kind of look that you like, lots and lots of fraying. When you cut on the diagonal, so therefore you're at a 45-degree angle, your fabric doesn't fray, because you imagine the bits that you're cutting, all of the edges are going to be like this, so there's nowhere for them to go if they try to fray. So if you use a scrubbing brush, or I've put mine in the washing machine, all you get across the edges of the fabric are a really lovely fluffiness instead of a frayed effect. So you carry on cutting all the way across. You can use a scrubbing brush, and you can be quite firm with those as well. So if you're a little bit impatient and you want to get this finished now, then give this a good old scrub and make it go fluffy. When you pop it into the washing machine and tumble dry, this is the kind of look that you get. So you can see how fluffy it all is, and it's very, very soft as well. And you can see what I mean about the two most important layers of fabric are going to be the blue at the bottom and the green at the top. You really can't notice the colours of the fabric in between. So they're there just to add an extra little bit of colour, and of course to add that texture as well. So I did say that my fabric may twist a little bit, and it may not be absolutely perfectly rectangular when I take it out of the wash. So what you're going to do next is, if you've got your rotary cutter ruler and mat, then just trim that down to a rectangular size. Okay, so all of my corners are nice and square at 90 degrees. And now my rectangle measures 13 inches across, and that's 9 inches in depth. So I've already put on the back of here a piece of wadding or batting, and I've used a spray adhesive to do so. And now I've got two choices. So I can either make my clutch bag so that it sits that way, so it's quite square, or I can make it a long, thin baguette type of bag, so I get that kind of size, and I think that's what I'm going to do. So I will need two of these pieces, so I'm going to cut into the one that I've already started here. So again, I'd normally use my rotary cutter and ruler for this, but don't have them handy. And we'll just cut around the edges. I normally use a bigger pair of scissors as well, to be honest, but we're good to go. So I'm basically using the one piece as a template. So that's across the bottom. In fact, I will put those down and use my big scissors. Thank you. Seamless. And down the sides here. Oh, that's better. Now, my bag's going to fold over about this much. So that's going to be the flap of my bag. And the back of my bag, so I'm going to use that as a template to cut out the front of my bag. This will make sense in just a second. So I don't need those anymore. So there's the back, and there's the front. And that's how my bag's going to fold over. What I'm also going to do is to sew right on the front a contrasting button, like so. I could round the corners off a little bit, but I kind of like all of the angles and the right angles. I like to keep that quite square. And then we'll need to take a lining piece and cut those to the same sizes as the pieces we've got here. So there's lining to go with the back and the flap, and there's lining to go with the front piece there. What I do need to do is to put some wadding on the wrong side of my front panel. So I'm just using wool wadding because it just happens to be what I have. If you have some stabiliser or interfacing, it doesn't have to be wadding. I just think with a bag of this kind of size, and particularly because it's long, it needs something to give it a little bit of firmness. Otherwise, you get a baggy bag, which may be the look that you're going for, but it's not what I want. So we'll stick that down and trim it to size. Lovely. Now let's rearrange this again so we get an understanding of the way that the whole thing works. So that goes there, that goes there, that one's on there, and that one's on there. And then the front of the bag will sit on top of the lining like so, and this folds over. Now I'm fastening it with a magnetic clasp, so this needs to go on now. So I'll take the two sections. If you haven't done this before, you'll have one section that has that is quite fat, and that's got an indentation in it. That goes on the bag section, that's the bit that's magnetic. And then the second half is quite slim, and that's got the outer bit, so that's how the two go together. So the outer bit is going to go on the flap, and they're quite strong. And then there are two pieces, which are the backing pieces, which look a little bit like that. So what I'm going to do is to measure and mark where I want this to go. So I know that it needs to sit in the centre. I also need to make sure that the clasp is fitted at least ½ inch away from the edge of the seam, because otherwise I'm not going to be able to sew around the seam because I'll be hitting the clasp. So let's fold just my lining section in half. Don't need that for now. And I'll just crease that so I know where the centre is. And then I'm going to put my clasp an inch from the edge. So I'm just going to make a little mark an inch down here. On the back of the lining fabric, excuse me, I'm going to put a little scrap of fabric like so. And that's to strengthen the hole, because you saw how strong these clasps are. I don't want it pulling at the fabric when I'm opening and closing the bag. Now take the back of your magnetic clasp. We're going to place that centre hole over the mark that I've just made on the crease line, so I know it's right in the middle. And I'm going to make a little mark either side. And then you'll need either a very small sharp pair of scissors or your quick unpick and cut into those lines. Don't cut them too big, because if you cut a big hole, you've got a big hole. If you cut a hole that's too small, you can always make that a little bit bigger if you need to. Now the prongs on either side of the clasp will go through those holes. Put the back on and squish. It doesn't really matter whether they fold inwards or outwards. You probably find them easier to squish going outwards, but that's entirely up to you. It doesn't really matter. Now the opposite side of my clasp is going to go on the front of my bag. So I don't really need an extra bit of strengthening fabric because I've already got the wadding or batting on the back of this. And I'm not really going to be able to fold this in half and mark it. So I'm going to measure it in half and mark it. So that's 6.5 inches. So I can see that's here. And as I fold the top over, I can actually gauge exactly where that should sit. Don't pull it too tight, because when you get all of the other pieces together, it's going to fold the top of the front of the bag over, and we don't want that. So just leave maybe 1/4 inch or so at the top, so that sits nice and loosely, like so. So I know I want the second half to be directly under this at 6.5 inches across, which is here. And there I can make my mark. So the same as before, put the backing piece over the mark and draw a little hole either side. And then make your incision all the way through and through the wadding as well. It'd be easier to go this way over the edge of that frayed bit. and then push the prongs all the way through. Put the back on and squish. So that's how it's going to fit together. That folds over like so, and that's sitting right in the centre. So let's put the whole bag together. So first of all, we're going to take the two front pieces and we're going to sew them together straight across the top. So I'll switch my machine off and on again, because you remember how I moved the needle right over to the right hand side. The easiest way to reset it, to get the needle back into the central position, is just to switch your machine off and on again. And I'm sewing with 1/4 of an inch seam allowance this time. If you've got a needle up down function on your sewing machine, then use it to keep your needle down as you sew. You could pin these together if you prefer, first of all, but as long as you hold the edges of your fabric together, then there shouldn't really be any need for pinning. If you have a walking foot on your sewing machine, that may help here as well, because we've got lots of layers of fabric. Then I'm going to fold this over, and because we do have all of those bulky layers of fabric, I'm going to top stitch just across that seam to hold the layers together. And here you go. So I'm just keeping the edges of the frayed fabric flat here as well, because there is a tendency for it to catch underneath your needle. Like that. And here you go. There, so that's nice and neat across the top. I'm going to add a little loop inside my bag, because I thought it might be handy to have somewhere to put keys. So I'm just going to take a piece of ribbon about, I don't know, about 4 inches long. I've got a tiny D-ring, that's a 1/2 inch D-ring, that I'm going to thread through the ribbon. And that needs to go on the inside, facing inwards. So just inside the top of the bag like so. Again, not too close to the seam. In fact, we'll go from this side, I think, why not? Not too close to the seam, so that when I sew the bag together, I'm going to be sewing over the hardware. You could do this in reverse and have a little hook on the outside of your bag, so that you could attach a wristlet to it if you prefer. And this I'm sewing close to the edge, so I'm just tacking or basting that in place. I'll trim that down later. So that's there like so. That's going to be quite handy. Right, so now we're going to piece the whole thing together. So there's my outside, there's my lining. That's how I need all of the pieces to go together, so that that folds over. So we're going to take the two outside pieces first of all and sew them right sides together without the lining. And I'm just going to sew straight across the bottom. You can see how some of the wadding has shifted a little bit as I've been sewing. So my seam allowance here is just a little bit wider than it was previously. There we go. So right sides together means that when the bag's finished, it folds over like so. So now I need to put the lining piece on top. right sides together. So the front of the bag is sandwiched in between. And this time I am going to put a few pins in here to hold it in place. So I've got a larger piece of fabric we're working with now. Okay, now this time I'm going to sew all the way around the top of the bag, but leave a gap in the bottom where I've already sewn. So I'm going to find it easier to sew from this side so that I can match up my stitch lines. So let's start about 4 inches from the edge, so I get a nice gap in the centre. I'm going to reverse a few stitches backwards to strengthen that seam, because that turning gap is going to be where I turn the whole thing inside out. So there could be a little bit of stress on the seam there. Let's go around the corner. Line at the edges. Just making sure I'm not sewing over those pins, because I did pin them from the other side. I just need to make sure as well that that little D-ring is poked onto the inside. That can come out now. Back down to that seam at the base where I first started, and then we'll sew again up to about 4 inches, reverse back. Okay, let's take those pins out. I'm going to cut across the corners, and that helps to reduce the bulk of fabric, so my corners, when I turn this the right side out, are going to be pointy. There we go. And then let's turn it the right side out. Just going to push those corners in with some tweezers. There, so when we turn this through initially, we're going to be on the lining side. So that's my turning gap. So I'll need to sew that closed by hand. So, oh, I should have threaded some thread in there first, shouldn't I? So I'm just going to use an overage stitch to sew this closed, because it's in the bottom of the lining, so it's unlikely that you're going to see it. Now when I'm sewing this closed, I don't want to take the thread all the way through the outside of the fabric, because you're going to see it. So let's just catch the fold of that side. Oops. So I'm not pulled through. Just fold the fabric over so it covers the seam, and then actually a little slip stitch would probably be easier. So just catch both sides of the gap, small stitches to make them nice and strong and invisible, and we'll sew all the way across here to close it up. So that's the bottom of my bag sewn up from the lining side. Now we're going to turn the whole thing the right side out, and we're almost finished. We're going to push out those corners. There's my little bit for my keys. Out you go. Got one thread there that needs trimming off. There we go. So the final thing that I'm going to do is to top stitch around the edge here, because again that's going to hold those layers nice and flat. So let's start from just inside the front of the bag where that seam finished. I'm starting there. So I'm going to lock my stitches here, and then we'll sew. Needle down and around. And I think particularly when you've got this many layers of fabric, the seam is almost trying to fight back. So the top stitching just gives it a really nice professional finish. Now then, I'm coming up to the metal clasp, and I don't want to sew over it, so I'm actually going to stop and move my needle right over to the left hand side, so I'm avoiding hitting the needle on the clasp. You could, if you wanted to, put your zipper foot on the sewing machine if it's a little bit too close. Back down this side. Again, matching up or stopping sewing when I'm level with the seam that goes across the front of the bag. Then I'm just going to turn it around and just go across the corner. And either back stitch a couple of stitches or use your lock stitch if you've got that on your sewing machine as well. Okay, let's snip off any extra threads. I would probably steam this rather than press it, just so that I keep that lovely fluffiness of the chenille. You can come off there. Let's fold this over, like so. So I think that looks lovely as it is. I did say there was going to be one final touch, then I'm going to add a button to right in the centre just there. It adds a little bit of texture, I think. And that's going to go over the top of where the clasp is on one side, but I'm not going to sew it all the way through. So I know exactly where it should sit, because it's over the back of the clasp, so that's in the centre. And I'm just picking up the fabric on the top. In fact, I'll tell you what we'll do. Let's leave that end unknotted. Yes, let's do it that way. I'm going to go through the button first, then into the fabric. I can feel where I'm going because I can feel where that clasp is. Then back out through the button, leaving the end long, over to the other side, back into the fabric again. And up that side. And I'm going to make a loop in here so that I can tie it on. So, take the needle out, I can trim that down later. Then I'm going to tie the whole lot in a big knot. And trim that down. There we go. And that is my bag all finished.